Let's move on. Part two. So new ways to ask why. So let's look at some better ways. So in part two, we're going to focus on 5 different strategic ways to ask why questions. And first one, or the first 4, about reasons. So the first reason is a simple logical improvement to remove the ambiguity. Remember, I talked about ambiguity being a big problem with why questions. So our first goal is just to remove the ambiguity. Part 2, or the second step, we'll look at how to ask for reasons from kind of a curiosity tone of voice, a curiosity nuance. Part 3, or step 3, we'll look at from a factual perspective, then from a very showing respect perspective, and then finally we'll look at how to ask purpose questions without ambiguity. And these will be quite direct. In the final part of today's webinar, we'll look at more sensitive techniques. Okay, so here in part 2 of today's webinar, we're looking at 4 reason-based questions and 1 purpose-based questions. And again, our goal is to totally destroy, that's pretty powerful, remove this ambiguity. All right, let's get busy. Let's look at the first one. So a basic logical improvement. Whenever I want to find out somebody's reason for doing something, I can use these 3 techniques: rather than, as, not, over. So if I say to you, why did you go to Harajuku? Remember, before that had natural ambiguity, didn't it? Why did you go to Harajuku? I could have wanted to know the purpose to buy a new jacket, but I also could have wanted to know why specifically Harajuku, why not Shibuya? So this one here, we want to know the reason, meaning why Harajuku? Harajuku is not so big. I mean, it's stylish, it's trendy, it's fashionable, but it's not so big. I mean, there are not so many, big department stores there. Why Harajuku? So if you want to remove this ambiguity, if you want to basically logically improve your reason questions, use rather than, and, not, or over. And these take away any ambiguity of purpose. They always make sure the listener understands that you want to know the reason, the background behind that decision. So why did, subject verb, rather than. Rather than, we can use a noun or we can use an ing verb. Why did, subject verb, and, not. Usually and, not, we only use a noun, and, not. And why did, subject verb, over, we can use a noun or we can use an ing verb. Let's look at some examples of this in practice. Now, I apologize here. I'm going to apologize. Today, you're going to hear this a lot. Why did you choose vendor C? So in my job, I do a lot of project management for IT projects. And during my project management, my clients always want to understand why I chose vendors A or B or C. So I always have to get different estimates, different offers for the contract. And so some of my clients demand that I get 3, some demand that I get 5, some demand that I choose whatever I want. And most of them demand a minimum of 3. And that's good, because it means that we get the best price, right? I have to speak to 3 different solution providers. And then finally, the winner, and it's not always the cheapest one. The cheapest one is often the winner, but it's not always the cheapest one. Sometimes, vendor C is better than vendor B because they have more talent, more skill. So today we're going to use this question. Why did you choose vendor C? Vendor means seller or provider. So as an example, if your company is planning to change their email service, you have a lot of different vendor solutions. You have Microsoft Office or Microsoft 365, Google, you have Google email. What's another one? Yeah, lots of other email services, but I can't think of them right now. So these are vendors. So why did you choose vendor C? So let's, and then we had other choices, vendor A, vendor B, things like that. So let's have a look at the language. So we could say, why did you choose vendor C rather than choosing vendor B? I put the word choosing in parentheses here because this is optional. The reason why it's optional is because it's the same verb as the earlier part of the sentence. If I used a different verb, I should always keep it. Hey, Nick, why did you choose vendor C rather than going with vendor B? Or hey, Nick, why did you choose vendor C rather than selecting vendor B? So if you want to use a different verb to make more variety, that's totally great. That's totally fine. But if it's clear that the verb is the same as the verb from the first part of the sentence, you just don't need to use the verb. So why did you choose vendor C rather than vendor B? Let's look at that question. If we ask this question in a business meeting, there's no real ambiguity about reason or purpose. This is absolutely reason. It's absolutely a question about not what we want to do, but what the background of this decision is, what the background of this choice is. So our goal is to remove that ambiguity. Hey, why did you choose vendor C rather than vendor B? Other choices are and not. And not. You can use a verb, but I almost never do. I almost always just simply use a noun or a noun phrase. Hey, Nick, why did you choose vendor C and not vendor B? And again, that tells me explicitly, not ambiguously, explicitly, I want to know the background of your reason for that choice. I don't want to know the purpose. I want to know the background for that reason. Is it price? Is it expertise? Is it experience, expertise? I guess the same. Is it relationship? What's the background? Or number three, why did you choose vendor C over choosing vendor B? And again, in this case, sometimes I might use a verb. And if I want to use a different verb, that's okay. So when I use the second one and not, I only use this when it's very obvious the same verb is happening twice. With choices, the first choice and the third choice, I can change the verb if I want, but if it's obvious what the verb is, I normally just cut the verb. So now you've got three options. You've got three choices. Why did you choose vendor C rather than vendor B and not vendor B over vendor B? Nice and simple. So this is a great way to ask a why question. It's a better logical improvement. Okay, so now let's have a look at curiosity. How do we do this with more curiosity? Curiosity, we're going to use the word how come. How come? Now, how come naturally means the reason. It doesn't really mean the purpose. So rather than and not over, this is optional. You don't need these. How come uses a totally different setup. How come does not need an auxiliary verb. How come you chose? How come you did this? How come you arrived? How come plus the subject? So remember earlier, I told you about one of the most common mistakes people make with why questions. They say, why you? Why you? Why you? That mistake now becomes okay if we use how come. How come you? How come? So how come plus the subject is totally fine. When we ask why questions, we have to use that auxiliary verb. Why did, why are, why were. But if we're using how come, we simply use the subject. So again, we're going to use the vendor C choice. I know you're going to see this a lot. Sorry. So how come you chose? So you got to be careful here. You got to use that verb that matches the situation. Hey, how come you chose vendor C? How come you chose vendor C? How come you chose vendor C? You don't need to use the extra parts, rather than, and, not, over. But if you do, it's great because you're going to totally remove that ambiguity. So the phrase how come almost always means reason, not purpose. When I say, yeah, how come you went to Harajuku? I'm not asking about the purpose. I'm asking about the reason. Oh, I see, your favorite shop is in Harajuku. I got it. So how come by nature usually means reason, not purpose, but not always, and sometimes native English speakers mix it together. So if you want to totally remove that ambiguity, and that's our goal. Being great communicators is about totally removing ambiguity and letting people use their time with understanding, not confusion. You can still use the same techniques. Hey, how come you chose vendor C rather than vendor B? How come you chose vendor C and not vendor B? How come you chose vendor C over vendor B? All right, so that was with curiosity. What about now factual? Factual means no emotion, just give me the facts. So very subtle, nuanced differences here. The first one, a logical improvement, is just a why question, but improved to remove the ambiguity. The second one shows a little bit of curiosity. How come? And so when you use the phrase, how come, it tells the listeners that you are interested, you're quite interested. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's up to you. But the listener understands your curiosity. Now, we're just going to use it from a very sort of factual basis. So very simply, what's the reason? What's the reason? What's the reason you did this? What's the reason you did that? And again, this time we don't need that auxiliary verb. What's the reason? As before with how come, you don't need to use these extra techniques rather than, and, not, over. You don't need to use them because what's the reason by nature means reason. It's in the sentence, right? What's the reason? But if you want to totally remove that ambiguity, then you can keep doing that. So again, we'll just put these examples in here. And I know you're going to see it a lot. Sorry about that. What's the reason you chose vendor C rather than vendor B? What's the reason you chose vendor C and not vendor B? What's the reason you chose vendor C over vendor B? So what's the reason you chose? For me, this is one of the best tools for a business situation. What's the reason? If I want to be a little bit direct, but factual about somebody's reasons, I say, what's the reason? So in business situations, I don't use the word why that much. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this section. Okay, showing respect. Now, this is a little bit tricky. If I'm speaking to my boss, asking why questions are tricky, aren't they? You know, why did you make that decision? Well, I'm sorry. She's the boss. He is the boss, right? It's their decision. But if we want to find out the reason in a respectful way, we can use this technique. A little bit more challenging. We use this verb end up, end up. So we can say, why did subject end up? So why did we as a company, or why did we end up doing something? Or why did you end up or what's the reason you ended up? What's the reason we ended up? So if we say why, we got to have that auxiliary verb. So that's, in this case, that's the past. Why did we end up? Why did you end up doing this? Or if we use what's the reason, we don't need the auxiliary verb. So what's the reason you ended up choosing A and not B? And you can use over rather than. I'm not going to focus on that anymore. But the key point about this idea of showing respect is using the verb end up before the main verb tells the listener that we respect their process. We understand that they're not a child in the supermarket making a quick decision about some candy. And I'm sure Japan's probably the same, but in the UK, when I was a kid, they used to put the candy by the register, by the cash register at the end, because they want all the moms to be waiting in line or the dads to be waiting in line, and they want the kids to be, I want the candy, I want the candy. And that became illegal about 20 years ago, about 15, 20 years ago. So that's a quick decision. It's quick action, quick thought, quick process. So to show respect for somebody's decision process, and not just a kid wanting candy right now, we use this verb end up. And it's a small change, but it hugely impacts the way people listen to this. So if I say, let me go back to this one. What's the reason you chose vendor C? Or why did you choose vendor C over vendor B? And now if I use this one, why did you end up choosing vendor C rather than vendor B? Or hey, what's the reason you ended up choosing vendor C and not vendor B? It totally changes the tone of voice. It totally makes this a respectful question. It says, look, I'm not judging you. I'm not here to pass judgment. I'm not here. You're the boss, right? I'm respectful, but I'd like to understand the background. So again, this is why we want to go beyond eikaiwa in these webinars. These are the skills we need to deal with our management teams. If you work for Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, any big tech company that's based overseas, you got to work out how to communicate to the right tone of voice. So this is the best way to ask respectfully a why question for reasons, not purpose, for reason. Why did we end up increasing the price rather than keeping it the same? What's the reason we means the company. What's the reason we ended up canceling our product launch next month? If you use end up, it's only two new words, end up, but you're strongly communicating that I'm not judging you. There's no, you're the boss. I'm just me, but I'd like to know, and I'm curious. And this is very powerful, extremely powerful. And I'll talk about the word why now as well, a little bit more. The word why in English is somewhat dangerous because we often connect why with challenge. Why did you come home late last night? Well, I'm sorry. Why did you come home late? Were you drinking? No. I went to the library. Not true. The why questions by nature in our personal experience can sometimes be aggressive, or they can be a judgment on us. So why questions by nature are sometimes scary, and people get defensive about why questions. That's the nature of people. I've seen so many intelligent, logical people get very defensive very quickly when somebody asks them a why question. So if you want to do it with a sort of a respectful distance, put the phrase end up. So why did you end up? Or even better, hey, John, so what's the reason we ended up choosing vendor C and not vendor B? Huh? That is totally respectful, and it's a great way to find out about the reason. All right, last one, purpose. This is going to be a little bit direct. So direct means not rude, but straight to the point, nice and simple. We're going to say, what's the purpose of? And that's it. It's not rocket science. So change the word why. Instead of asking why about purpose, ask what is the purpose of doing something, or what is the purpose of a noun, or what was the purpose of doing something, or what was the purpose of a noun. Hey, so maybe you're asking your staff member, so what was the purpose of you going to Osaka? So you going to Osaka, or you can use a noun. Hey, what was the purpose of your trip to Osaka last week? So you can use a subject and an ing verb. If it's obvious that it's about you, then you can cut you. So what was the purpose of going to Osaka last week? It's obviously about you. What was the purpose of the team going to Osaka last week? Okay, clearly that's not you. That's a different topic, different focus. So when you want to ask a purpose question, don't use why questions anymore. Stop using why. Say, what was the purpose, or what is the purpose? If you ask this, the listener knows it's not about the background reason. It's about the forward strategy. It's about the future strategy. It's about the next step. It's about what we wanted to do, not why we did it, but what we wanted to do. And again, that shows why the word why is by nature ambiguous. All right, it's time for another quiz. Here we go. So let's take a look. Question number 1.